us today. My name is Alex Tadelboim. I am the new co-director of OUBEP. For those of you who are familiar with OUBEP, you know that we've been running these lecture series since the start of the COVID crisis, and our aim was actually to share some of the research that was happening in real time within the Department of Economics here in Oxford. We started with a pandemic, of course, and we wanted to expand to topics that people have been concerned about around the world and that really directly impact business strategies. So this time last year, we talked about the economics of discrimination and then towards the spring. This month, as we are hurtling towards the COP26, we wanted to look at the fundamental issues around climate change, and we are very grateful to our sponsors, Mike Crow and the NatWest Group, for making this event possible. So if you'd like to better understand the link between economics and climate change, we actually have a short bespoke course which you can find out about on our website by clicking the link below right here, a green link, and it will take you to the webpage about it. So just one more piece of housekeeping before we begin. Please put all your questions in the chat. I will see them all, and I will try to direct them at our distinguished speaker today as they come in, hopefully at the right time. So to kick us off today in our second installment of the Economic Sustainability Series, we're delighted to welcome Stéphane Hallegatte. Stéphane is the lead economist of the World Bank Climate Change Group. He was a lead author on the fifth assessment report of the IPCC, and he's an author of dozens of papers published in leading journals in multiple disciplines, many of which I've read when I was studying economics of climate change, and several books and World Bank reports, including Shockwaves: Managing the Impacts of Climate Change on Poverty. I think we will not embarrass Stéphane by mentioning that a few years ago, he won the Bertoni Award for his work on the link between climate change adaptation and poverty reduction, which is indeed going to be the topic that he is going to talk to us today. Stéphane, if you would like to share your slides, we can seamlessly transition into your presentation, and you have the floor for 45 minutes or so. Once the talk is over, we can, of course, have maybe 15 minutes of questions or so. But as I said, please do put questions in during Stéphane's presentation.
Yeah, thank you very much, Alex, and thanks for the invitation and for making the time. My presentation will have a few big blocks. So indeed, if you have questions, we can just take them along the way, so that I'm not just speaking alone for like 45 minutes, looking at myself in that screen. So really feel free to just interrupt and pose your questions. What I want to try to do today is first to start with the big challenges linking economics and climate change, what we know, what we don't know, and how that transfers into the design of policies and strategies to tackle climate change. And I try to cover both the challenge linked to reducing emissions and the challenge of adapting to impacts of climate change and becoming more resilient. And I'll start with basically the analytics, what we know and how we design policies. And I will go to conclude on the World Bank Group Climate Change Action Plan, which is the series of commitments we made a few months ago on how we will contribute to the achievement of the objectives of the Paris Agreement, so the international agreement on climate change signed 6 years ago. This is a second action plan, so I can also talk a little bit about what we have achieved in the past. So I'll try to go from the principles to how we apply that in our operations. So I'll share my screen, showing you a few slides to just cover these issues. So I hope that you have that in full screen. If not, just let me know. The first thing I want to discuss is the need for us as World Bank Group development institution to look at climate change not as a separate problem, but as a development challenge in the middle of many other development challenges. And let me start with one problem we have with a lot of the work that has been done in the past on the economics of climate change, the fact that it was sort of like forgetting about the development context. So a lot of the early economics on climate change assume that you have basically a perfect world, and then you have one problem: you have climate change. And if you're thinking that way, if you're looking at climate change as an independent problem for the rest of the development challenges, you end up talking about the trade-off between spending money now for mitigation costs against getting benefits in the form of avoided impacts of climate change in the future. And all you're talking about is this trade-off between the short term and the long term, between different generations. And a lot of this literature on the economics of climate change focused on the discount rate, which is how do we value the future versus today's situation. And in an operational context, this really doesn't work. So we're working in countries where we have huge challenges in terms of economic efficiency. So you see here a picture of a traffic jam. A lot of cities in the countries we're working in are very congested, which really reduce the economic advantage that cities offer. You're supposed to have a well-functioning big labor market. That's how cities create economic growth. And if you cannot travel in the city, it just doesn't work. And you can add issues linked to air pollution, which is killing millions of people per year and reducing the productivity of everybody else. On the right, it's an image of a generator. Many countries we're working in have low access to electricity and energy in general. And when people have access, reliability is very low, which means that you cannot, for instance, use the latest technologies in a lot of those countries, and people spend a lot of money in self-generation. So if you're looking at climate change without taking into account the fact that people don't have access to energy now, of course, you're missing a large part of the story. And here, the illustration is on energy, but you could talk about access to improved water and sanitation, you can talk about access to communication and rapid internet and so on. Another picture of waste management, also a massive challenge in a lot of countries in the world. And on the left bottom corner, a little view of the situation in terms of debt and sustainability of public finance. We're also working in a context where a lot of countries are already struggling to finance their development and to keep a balanced budget. And of course, there are very strong interaction between the fiscal situation of countries and what they can do for the environment. So if you're working in a context like that, things become very different in terms of how you see the problem. You have a range of development challenges. All countries have their own development priorities. And the question is, how do I achieve those development priorities? And climate change is one of those development priorities and objectives, but it has to be put in the context of all of the other ones. So how do we do that? We're trying to, every time, look at climate action as a way to achieve climate and non-climate development goals. So let me give you an example. This is a tool we developed recently with the IMF called the Carbon Pricing Assessment Tool. On the left, you see how a carbon price instrument, so it can be a carbon tax, it can be many other ways of putting a price on emissions, how it would affect the carbon emissions in Ghana. But of course, Ghana is emitting next to nothing at the global scale. It's a poor country with a small economy. So if we're looking at carbon pricing, we can look at the figure in the middle, which is how much revenues the government in Ghana could get through a carbon price instrument like a carbon tax. And here in a country that has financial problem, you see how carbon tax can become something a little bit more interesting, because the country has spending needs, and you see that you could very easily raise close to 2% of GDP in resources. You know that African countries tend to have very low tax revenues, about 10-15% of GDP, compared with more than 30 in most countries. A carbon tax is a simple, easy tool to raise more revenues. It's very difficult to evade, so you can affect your population in a way that is more fair than with other tools, and it's cheap to administer. So for countries with limited resources, it's also really good. On the right, you see how revenues from a carbon pricing scheme can compare with current spending in health. And without getting into the details, in many countries, you could double spending in health with the revenues from a carbon tax. So here, really the idea is, if you talk about a carbon pricing as a policy in Ghana, you should mention the left-hand side figure, like the effect on emissions and how it contributes to a global public good of controlling climate change. But of course, if you don't talk about the revenue raising and what you can do with those revenues, you're completely missing the point. So that's a very important thing, that we really have to look at what countries want to do and connect what we propose in terms of climate policy, not only to the climate objectives, but to the other objectives. And the other important challenge is, and an advice we give to all of our teams, is to use the right baseline. So if you're working in Ghana and you're comparing a scenario in which Ghana doesn't do climate policy or Ghana does climate policy, the right baseline, so the case where Ghana is not doing climate policy, is not a case where nobody is doing climate policy. A lot of the big countries, and this is what you see on this figure, have committed to reduce emissions to net zero by 2050 or 2060. And it means that all countries, whether they act or not, will be affected by decarbonization. So what everybody's talking at the moment is the CBAM, so the Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism that the EU will be implementing. So the idea is to tax imports based on their the difference in the carbon price paid, at least for some goods. And today the CBAM proposed by the EU is very limited in scope, but there is this expectation that this will become broader and bigger as time goes by. So everybody is focused on the CBAM, but it's really not the only way the global decarbonization will affect trade. You can very easily imagine that consumer demands will also shift. So for instance, the wood that people want to consume might become more like wood from sustainably harvested forests. And this could have a big impact on a lot of countries exporting wood. And of course, there is this big question on the demand for oil and gas, and how fast this might drop, and what it will do to countries exporting oil and gas, depending on what type of oil and gas they export. So a lot of impact on trade, regardless of what countries decide to do. But not only, also impact through innovation. So if you look at the countries on this figure, you probably have 95% of all of the patents that today are covered by a net zero commitment by 2050 or 2060, which means that countries where innovation takes place are countries that are committed to stop emitting carbon. So kind of like give a hint that where R&D is going to be, where innovation is going to be, is more likely in zero carbon technologies than in fossil fuel technologies. And it means that for countries that are followers, it might become just being stuck in an outdated set of technologies if they stay on fossil fuel technologies instead of moving. So typical example is if you imagine that electric vehicle will soon become cheaper than traditional vehicles, getting stuck on traditional vehicles if all of the innovation is going into electric vehicles is, of course, not a great idea. So from our perspective, one question that we start asking is whether countries can imagine becoming high-income countries, without being part of the decarbonization process. And of course, for countries like Brazil or Turkey, which are already very integrated in global supply chain, this is probably even more important than for the rest. So, but short story is, countries might benefit from climate policies because it makes them part of this group of countries decarbonizing and part of the global economy instead of staying on the side of it. And if you're missing that, you might find that climate policy is costly. Well, in fact, it's not costly if you take into account what the rest of the world is doing. So taking into account these two dimensions, first, inside countries, there are a lot of problems and climate action can help fix them. And the rest of the world is moving, means that what you're doing today in terms of climate policy might be just a complete synergy with your development. And not all climate action is a cost today for a benefit tomorrow, but it can be just a benefit tomorrow for a benefit today. So the way we're trying to frame this problem is, if you look at all of the policies we can talk about, some of them will be synergies with development. If you invest in public transit in cities, if you invest in very cheap solar electricity, those things, you basically reduce emission and you're also contributing to development. And from a government perspective, there is no trade-off. But there are policies that create trade-off. If Turkey wants to retrofit all of the buildings, this costs a lot of money, and this money cannot be used for something else. So we kind of like organize our discussion in terms of, there are the things which are obvious good ideas, there are synergies and some trade-off. But we also compare things which are urgent and things which are less urgent. And here the definition of urgent is something that will be more expensive to do if we wait. To give you an example, if you're in a low-income countries investing in the power system, if from the beginning you take into account that you want a decarbonized power system, you have many options to do that at a relatively low cost. If you neglect that issue and you invest for 10 years in a coal power plant pipeline, and then after 10 years you decide that you want to decarbonize, it will be very expensive to do it because you'll have all of these brand new but already outdated coal power plants. So some of the actions have to happen now because, for instance, we're investing in the power system anyway, and we have to decide which direction we go. And something we can wait. So if you're looking at, I don't know, appliance, for instance, they have like a 5 to 10 year lifetime. So if you decide to change off your appliance to make them more energy efficient in 10 years, it doesn't cost you more than doing it today. So we're trying to think in those terms. What is really urgent? What can wait? What is a synergy? What is a trade-off? And of course, when something is urgent and a synergy, no need to think too much about it. We can go ahead. And when something is not urgent and creates trade-off, in especially low-income countries, I think that's fine. It can wait. Then there are like the two more interesting blocks. When something is a synergy, but it's not very urgent, then the question is the capacity of the governments, especially the governments we're working with have low capacity in many cases. They cannot do everything at once. So if we have to prioritize, we will do things that are urgent and not things that are less urgent. But where it gets really interesting are the things which are urgent and creates trade-off. One example is the retrofit of buildings I was talking about earlier. But also if you look at forestry, for instance, some countries have a business model that includes deforestation. If you stop deforestation brutally, it has some short-term costs. How do you manage that? And here, this is where we're working in very details to understand how to design those policies to minimize or even avoid the trade-offs. For instance, carbon pricing can affect poor people. That's a trade-off. But if you use the revenues to help poor people through cash transfers or like energy support, you can avoid the trade-off. So sometimes it's not the policy itself. It's really, you can tweak the design to avoid the trade-offs, and sometimes you can't. Typical example is when a country with financial issues has to invest quite a lot of upfront capital to invest in renewable energy. Here, the international community has a key role to play. And it can be climate finance, like rich countries paying on behalf of poor countries to help them. But it can also be what we call non-concessional finance, which is just giving access to countries to loans, even if it's at commercial rate, to help finance those things. So this is really the framework we're thinking when we talk about green growth, when we talk about climate, that we really have to organize our thinking in terms of the urgency of action and the synergies and trade-off, and build a portfolio of measures based on that. Another thing which is really important for our business is that, as I said, in the countries we're working in, there are a lot of market failures and institutional issues. And when we talk about climate change, you can think that the main problem is the climate change externality. So basically, people don't pay when they emit carbon, and therefore they don't have an incentive to reduce that. And a lot of the economics literature has focused on carbon pricing. So you put the price on carbon, you correct that incentive, and everything is fixed. But if you look in practice, the problem we face, and today it's really obvious because in many cases, solar is less expensive than coal, and still countries invest in coal. So there's a question of why. And that's because of other issues like technological lock-in. You have people building coal power plants, you don't necessarily have a solar business. Also knowledge spillovers that makes people not invest in new technologies. Coordination failures, like for a long time, the electric vehicle development was a little bit stuck in this question of are we investing in battery first or in the vehicle first? Same thing in solar, where the feed-in tariffs have played a key role in triggering this massive investment that have reduced the costs. Also, we have issues with infrastructure and network effects. Typical example is in countries with a lot of potential for solar electricity, but if you don't have the grid able to manage that, it's just pointless to invest in solar. Another one is governance and institutions. So there are some energy markets where prices play absolutely no role. So you can put all of the carbon prices you want. If prices don't drive investments, it won't do anything. And finally, sometimes just like behaviors and social norms, like this is the way we do things. And you can think of the shift to electric vehicle as one of the things that requires a shift in how we do things, and behaviors will play a key role. So we have all of those obstacles. And when we look at our models and analytical tools, they are very good at looking at pricing issues, but not so good at the rest. But when we do operations in countries, we really have to look at the full range of things. And so without getting into the details of this figure, but basically what we ask our teams to look at is at policy packages, so that there is never like one policy that will fix everything. But people have to look at the incentive issues. So maybe you need to change prices. Then to look at information and behaviors, look at technologies, look at financing, and look at social impacts on the political economy. And in most cases, a good climate policy package will just cover this range of things. Because if you're trying to fix this problem with just one policy, you're very likely to fail. Before I shift to the next topic, maybe there are questions on what I just covered.
There are no questions from the audience as far as I can see, if you allow me, I do, I guess, have a very, very small question, which is that you talked about green innovation happening in net zero countries. But do you think, and maybe you're going to come to this later, do you think there's kind of still scope for perhaps green industrial policy even in the developing world?
That's a super important question, and a question that we discuss almost daily. I mean, there is such a big difference between China and Mozambique. That's, of course, the situation really depends on which country you're talking about. For a long time, industrial policies was considered a bad policy because it's difficult to do. And some countries make huge mistake and spend a lot of money in industrial policies that never really delivered. At the same time, some countries were super successful at doing it. and not by chance, because they did not do any industrial policy. They designed good industrial policies with an accountability framework, with some predictability, with some principles in terms of when you support a technology or a firm and it doesn't deliver, there is an automatic system that cuts support so that if it doesn't work, the support stops. While in many countries, the mistakes were that when it became obvious that something was not working, the money kept flowing for political reasons because it's difficult to stop the support. So our point is, when we say there is no answer to is industrial policy useful or not, but there are very important questions in terms of what is a good industrial policy and how to design it. And frankly, if we are looking at the timeline that we have, there is really no other way around some sort of industrial policy, in the sense policies that target one sector or one technology and put money into it. And it was solar and wind in the past. Now we see offshore wind, and we see, for instance, in carbon-free steel, a lot of industrial policies having very interesting results. So I think this is something that will be part of the solution. Whether each of our countries will be part of it really depend on the context and how they are able to manage the very complicated institutions you need to do that. And we know that it's very risky. So some countries want to do it. At the same time, they have to really understand that not all countries will be able to become a leader in solar or in electric vehicles. The competition will be really hard. So when they have very limited resources, whether they want to invest in something that is very risky is a very important question to discuss. Then, of course, countries do whatever they want. But I think being conscious of the risk is particularly important. I will get back a little bit on this in this second part.
If I may just ask you one more, because it's just come in, there's a really nicely related question from Megan, which is that, again, it's actually related to this point that countries with zero emissions target innovation. And she's asking, well, isn't it a sort of a chicken and egg situation that really it's the countries that innovate are the ones that end up giving the net zero target? Perhaps, you did you mean to imply that it is the net zero countries that actually end up being the innovators as a kind of causal mechanism? Or do you also think it's a kind of chicken and egg thing?
I mean, from the perspective of a developing country, I was mostly talking about a correlation. If you're a developing country and you're in this part of the development path where you basically imitate, you're not an innovator yourself or marginally, the question is, what do you imitate? And where is the best technology going? And so for countries which are just basically takers of innovation done somewhere else, they have to expect that more of this innovation will be in the carbon-free domain, and that they have to be able to use this innovation. So that's it's not so much a question of what is the driving process. There is clearly a link between countries committing to net zero and being innovators, because a lot of countries hope to benefit, especially if they give their industries a strong signal that this is a direction of travel. Stop overthinking this. We're going there. You have to find the technologies and you have to do it before the others. So I agree that there is this double link, this two-way causality between those commitments and innovation. That's for sure.
Super. We'll let you get on. I think there's more questions coming, and I'll leave them for a little bit later. But we can see all your questions coming in, so keep them coming.
Good. So the second part, which is another dimension of the challenge in terms of economics, is the fact that climate policy is really a deep structural policy and not a marginal change. So I used to make that point, but I think by now I don't need to make it too strongly. Like, whatever your temperature target, if you want to stop the increase in global temperatures, you have to bring emissions to net zero. So I think that's really important, because there are a lot of debates about 1.5, 2 degree and so on. But I think it's really important to flag that this is a very robust result, very strong, and that we know. If you think we cannot have temperatures increasing forever, you know that we will get to net zero, and the only question is when. And I think it kind of like helps simplify a little bit that problem. The other thing is the very important thing that And net zero seems super ambitious and difficult, but basically we know what's going to happen. There is a huge consensus on the path. The first pillars being net zero, zero carbon electricity. And now it seems that renewables will play the key role in that, aided with batteries and other storage solutions. And as you move to zero carbon electricity, you just electrify everything you can. Transportation, heat in your homes, cooking. And when you can't use electricity, you have to find another zero carbon fuel. And there are still debates on which one it will be. Hydrogen produced with renewables is sort of the front runner at the moment, but there are like other options. But we know that the big chunk of that will be electrification. And then for very heavy industries, we'll have to use other things, but that will be sort of a secondary thing. The big challenge is electrification. The third pillar is to do the first two. It gets really hard if we're not efficient in how we use energy, because then electricity demand go through the roof, and it's very difficult to meet that. So we know that we need in parallel to improve the buildings so that they consume less energy, that in transport, if we can use public transit instead of cars, it's much more efficient. And in agriculture, for instance, avoiding food waste could really help and go a long way in reducing emissions in the sector. And the last pillar is we have all of those fantastic ecosystems and forests capturing carbon from the atmosphere, and we're burning and destroying them very fast at the moment. The whole package becomes much easier if we preserve ecosystems and forests and even allow them to regrow so that they capture carbon from the atmosphere and create those negative emissions we need so much. And here really the challenge is not to let food production destroy everything, which means that you really need agriculture to become more efficient so that we can feed the world without using all of the land that we have. I don't think there is any debate on this big picture. This is basically the way it's going. But as you can see, there are a lot we can do now with the technologies we have and so on. But it requires some pretty deep structural change in many very important sectors. And you have this discussion on the long term, and then in parallel, you have this quest for like the low-hanging fruits and the cheapest options. And one of the kind of challenge we have is that if we focus only on the low-hanging fruits at one point in time, you will not get the least cost transition. So go back in 2007, we had, I show it in the left, this abatement costs curve produced by McKinsey. So basically what's on the left is very cheap, even negative costs. What's on the right is very expensive. And of course, the idea was, let's start with what's on the left and is cheap, and we'll move to the right only if we need to. And on the right, you find electric cars and solar PV. And to be frank, nobody really followed the advice from the McKinsey curve. People, especially in Europe, invested massively in solar PV. A few other countries subsidize massively electric cars. And like more than 10 years later, you get renewable energy being the cheapest way of producing electricity. And electric cars will very soon be cheaper than traditional cars. And we will get those like cheap renewable energy, cheap electric vehicles, only because some countries decided that they would invest in expensive solutions to bring the cost down. So I think that's really, really important. And I mean, we can discuss how to bring the cost down, because there is very early stage, it's all about R&D. Then it gets to more like pilot projects and creating like niche markets for some of the technologies. And when it gets more mature, it's like a boost to demand, like what we're doing now with subsidies for electric vehicles, for instance. So there is no one solution fits all, and you have to think of the pipeline and how you help technologies at different level of maturity. But basically the idea is we looking at the cheapest way of reducing emissions next year is really not helping. We really have to look at the long-term view. And if people invested in solar PV, even though it was expensive at the time. It's because even at the time, it was clearly super obvious that we would never manage to reduce emissions significantly without solar PV playing a key role. So we knew this technology was essential, and we just invested to bring its cost down. And now the question now here is, what is the next generation of that? And in what of the expensive technologies today should we invest? Clearly, people decided that hydrogen is one of them. But there are like other questions about small nuclear reactors, question about third and fourth generation biofuels, and of course, carbon capture and sequestration, which all of those things are super expensive today. And it's not completely clear in which one we want to invest and which one will deliver gains. This is really a big challenge for countries, because I think it was easier initially without solar and wind being cheap. There's just no way we do that. Today, it's a little bit more difficult to make those choices. The other dimension where we can't just say that let's look at the least cost options today and we'll fix the other problems later. These issues around lock-in and non-reversible impacts. So if you're looking at African countries, for instance, they emit nothing. So you might say, let's not even look at emissions in those countries. They have other issues. But at the same time, we know that those countries are building their cities at the moment. And if they build their cities like Atlanta, this is what you see on the left, or like Barcelona, the city will be the way they are. And you can't really transform back Atlanta into Barcelona at higher income level. And if you're in Atlanta, you just can't really use public transit as we know it. In Barcelona, it's much easier. So one of the questions is, even at low income levels, maybe we're creating lock-in if we don't take into account the need to eventually decarbonize the economy. And there are some very, very active debates in terms of when do we need to start talking about that. In a country like Malawi, one of the poorest in the world, maybe it's too early. But if you're looking, I don't know, for South Africa, it's clearly too late. So it's probably somewhere in the middle where we have to start thinking about that. Of course, it's connected to this question of stranded assets. If we invest in things and they have a long lifetime, but basically they have to be retired along the way to decarbonize, this will have an impact on the owners, on the workers, and also possibly, if the amount is big, on the financial system. And everybody is obsessed with coal power plants, and that's fine because it's important. But I'm also obsessed in buildings, because we can imagine that if some of the residential development we're doing now, very remote from jobs and services, are completely dependent on using individual cars, and the impact of decarbonization might be important than the value of those homes. And because the value of homes is so important in the financial system, this is clearly a worry. And the last part, which is explains why there are things we can't really delay, is there are things that cannot be reversed. And I'm here thinking especially at deforestation. If we continue deforesting the Amazon for a few decades, it just will be too late to save the whole thing. So there are things, even if they are difficult, we have to do them now. So with all of those issues, what are the solutions? So what we're trying to do is to help countries develop long-term strategies. And the idea is really to look at an objective for 2050 and beyond to guide short-term actions. Today, mostly rich countries have long-term strategies. What we're trying to do is to help poor countries also have the same. And the idea really is to have a vision for 2050 and beyond in terms of how do we fix those problems. And then you can work backwards to discuss, okay, what needs to happen today to just achieve that. And just to give you an example, we do that in the power sector. So you can discuss, and that's don't look at the details, but on the left, some simulations in terms of, okay, if I want to decarbonize my power sector, what do I need to invest in, and when do I need to invest, and how much it would cost? And that's an optimization. So that's basically the least cost way of reducing emission in the power sector. Once you have this least cost way, of course, most countries don't have like a planned economy where the government decides exactly what's going on. So once you have an idea of how you will get there, then the question is how to design the right set of policies, incentives, and maybe public investments to just get something which is close to the least cost path. And it's really important to do that over a very long period of time, because if you're looking only at the next 5 years, you will miss some of the things that are important to do now, only because it's necessary to get where we want to be in 2050. And one example is in the building sector. If you want in 2050 to be decarbonized, you need all of your buildings to be efficient and electrified. And if you take 3 decades to do it, it will be way cheaper than if you take only 1 decade to do it. So there are things that you want to start early with just because it makes the cost much, much lower. And if you don't have a long-term strategy, you will not see this. And the risk is to get stuck on cheap marginal changes and to forget about the big structural change that you need to see in parallel. My last part is on the political economy. But maybe like before, we'll just break here and see if there are questions.
There are questions, Stéphane. So last week, for context, we had Julian Allwood, who was talking about the path to absolute zero in the UK. And I think the 2 questions I'm going to pose to you now are inspired by this. There's one from Matilda, which is that one of the things that Julian had mentioned for the UK, and of course you're talking about the developing country context, is one pillar for meeting the climate challenge is the reduction in consumption. So is this something that you at all advise for some developing countries? Because of course there's differences between them.
So very important question. I got involved in this debate on degrowth and things like that recently. So first, for most of our countries, we need economic growth to provide what is considered as basic, decent life conditions. So in the aggregate, we see the need for growth in almost all of our countries, which doesn't mean that we don't have unsustainable lifestyles in the country. So even in very poor countries, you have very often very rich people that might have consumption lifestyles which are completely unsustainable. The decline in consumption creates a lot of confusion because it's very unclear what people are talking about. If you're talking about the amount of energy people consume or the amount of material that is extracted from nature, those things probably need to decrease, especially in high-income countries. But that's measured in material, like physical units, like in kilowatt hour of energy or in kilograms of iron. But when we talk about consumption, we often have in mind something which is in monetary units. And it's not because we reduce the amount of material and amount of energy that the consumption in dollar amounts will go down. So I think we have to be very clear that there are things we know that in the physical impact on nature has to decline, and that has a lot of implications. But that might be achieved completely by structural change in the basket of consumption, and doesn't mean that the total needs to decline. And my take on that is that in developing countries, it's pretty clear that consumption will increase and has to increase just because it's what decency tells us. Like, people have to have access to good education, healthcare, basic energy, sanitation, and so on. But even in rich countries, a lot of the people in the bottom half of the distribution don't have such a super easy life. And if you tell them that their income has to decline, it's very unlikely that you will get them on board. So I think we have to be very clear about what we're talking about, and that if the structure of consumption can shift, there is no reason why we would want the total amount to decline, even in rich countries. Doesn't mean that we don't want to do something for people driving 3-ton SUVs. That's, of course, is supposed to change, but it's more like a composition of GDP, consumption basket composition, and not so much the aggregate.
Thanks, Stéphane. I'm going to reserve this next question and let you actually crack on so you can get to the closer to the end of your presentation.
Okay, so the last part is really that and especially in the economics community, there is this huge focus on efficiency, and more there is this realization that successful policies are clearly not the most efficient. It's all about the political economy and the distributional and the narrative and so on. And so I want to talk a little bit about that to conclude. The first thing is people are completely obsessed with the impact of climate change on GDP. A lot of our work has been on the impact of climate change on poverty. And this is the map you see here shows you one of the scenarios we're working with. Our scenarios, I mean, for a pessimistic outlook is something up to 130 million people falling in poverty in this decade because of climate change. And the important part is, for this decade and probably the next, the main worry in terms of impacts of climate change is probably not on GDP. Impact on GDPs remain relatively small, but the impact on poor people is massive already. And this is something that is really important, because if you want to focus on like macroeconomic models and economic growth and so on, you're just completely missing the point that you have a huge part of the global population which basically has an income that's so small that whatever happens to them, you don't see in GDP numbers. And if you're worried about them, and we are, because our mandate at the World Bank Group is to eradicate extreme poverty, then climate change becomes a problem that's much, much, much bigger than what GDP numbers might suggest. So I think that's very first point, that if you want to compare the costs of climate change with just dollar amounts, you will look only at what happens to rich people, because rich people have the assets and they have the income. If you want to look at the impact on welfare and the impact on poor population, you have to use other metrics. That's the first very important point. The other very important point is that when we talk about distributional impacts, and we see more and more discussion about what it does to the first decile and the second decile and so on, but it's not only about income deciles. Both for climate change impacts and for climate policies, the impacts on the populations are very heterogeneous, not only by income level, but also in terms of where you live. And when you see what happened in France with the Gilets jaunes and the reaction against the increase in gasoline prices, it was a very specialized response, very strong in suburban places where people are fully dependent on cars to travel around. So maybe more than looking at the income deciles, having maps of who is affected and how would help us determine who needs help and who needs like special conditions, who needs something to make a policy acceptable at the national level. And right now we're really missing the tool. So this is at the left, a map of Cape Town, where we're looking at this issue. If you increase the price of fuel, what it does to the ability of people to access jobs. And clearly it's spatial much more than income driven. Second part is the intersection with gender, age, ethnicity, all of those other ways population can be described. It's particularly important in countries in conflict. If you're working in Sri Lanka, it's really important to look at the different ethnic groups, because you wouldn't want your climate policy to revive some of the tensions across groups. But it's also like even within a household. Like I was stuck to learn recently that in South Africa, the main purpose for travel is to go to school. So if you increase the price of traveling, you will affect children and young people more than the rest. And of course, there are differences across sectors. But it's really important to just look at that, because the way the population agrees or refuses climate policies depends on whether they see the implications as fairly distributed. And there is no protest of the first decile, but you can have a protest of coal miners or a protest of people in the suburbs. So the way the politics organizes itself it's not really per decile. And in our countries, it's also important because poor people, in most cases, don't have any voice in the political debate. So we really have to understand better the dynamics if you want to propose policies that work. I don't want to be too long, and I see time flying. So I just wanted to flag that for energy subsidies, we have a long experience of successful reforms. So it's possible to do it. But successful reforms have been reforms that had a few different things together. Not only the reform of energy prices and subsidies, but also a strong component in helping households adapt, a strong component on firms to help change technologies, and also a good narrative and communication so that people understand what the government's trying to do. And it comes back to my first point that changing prices is nice in a model, but in reality, things are much more complicated than that. The big challenge is to understand how people will transition from dirty, quote unquote, I shouldn't call that dirty, but carbon emitting jobs to greener jobs. We've been working with one of the former colleague of Alex on that, Pini Mili, on trying to understand how people transition from different types of jobs so that we can identify who can very easily go from a polluting job to a non-polluting job. Let's say somebody transitioning from developing big SUV to electric vehicles, and who cannot shift very easily, for instance, from coal mining to something. It's much more challenging. And by doing that, trying to really identify who is in trouble so that we can target interventions to help those people in priority. And it's important for labor policies, but also we have to think about that when we think about education and curriculums. And so we're trying to have like a complete view of the skilling of the population so that the transition becomes possible. But very clearly, there is this consensus that things will work or not work depending on whether we can create enough jobs that the people losing their job in the polluting activities can transition smoothly and get all of the support they need to do that. And we're not completely fully equipped for that. And I think this is a very interesting area of research at the moment. So this is a bit of a summary. I don't think I need to go through all of that, but that's my main point. I just wanted maybe to conclude in 2 minutes on the World Bank Group Climate Change Action Plan, which is really trying to implement those ideas in how we're doing our business in the next 5 years. And so it's based on the idea that climate change is a development challenge. And I will just show you this slide, which is the overview. We're trying to have this set of principles that we have to look at what climate change and policies do to people, that we need to think of nature as an area where we have solutions. So it's not only protecting nature, but it's also using nature-based solutions. And finally, that the bank group itself won't fix all of those problems. We need to work with others. And so there is a big component in who is doing what in this field. And so we have a few priorities in sectors, but also trying to help countries do the planning. I talked about long-term strategies, and also help financing those transitions by not only providing our own finance to help countries do it, but also help countries get the right policies and systems so that they can mobilize their own domestic finance and global capital markets so that the private sector resources can also help do that transition. So I'll stop here, but hope you have a few more questions.
Thank you, Stéphane. That was fantastic. Questions, please keep them coming. So there's one from an OUBEP steering group member, Claire Hamlin, and again, it's actually related to innovation that you talked about before, and I've saved a question to the end. So one of the things we heard about last week from Julian was, again, for the UK context, that some of the innovations were not going to happen on time. And I think the thing he was particularly worried about was carbon capture and storage. So, how would the World Bank look at technologies like this? Does the World Bank have a view on what developed countries should be doing with respect to kind of less certain technologies? Of course, you talked about very certain technologies that we know where they're going, like solar, but what about these kind of more speculative technologies? And how should, in fact, I guess, developing countries also think about these?
Yeah, so it's an important question that goes way beyond the question of innovation, which is the design of robust solutions. So one thing we're very worried about is countries doing a long-term plan where you have, for instance, capture, storage, and sequestration taking care of like 20% of the problem, and then you get to like 2045, you realize you won't have that technology, or you won't have it at the cost that makes it possible, and then you're stuck, and then the costs just explode because what you expected to be your solution is just not there. And we have this whole work program on what we call decision making under deep uncertainty, which is trying to take every strategy we're working on and stress testing it against many scenarios where we remove one technology, we remove another technology, but also we look at other sources of uncertainty, like some great technology is invented in 2035, and are you in position to just use it? Like if the cost of long-term battery storage is basically divided by 100 overnight because of some like solid battery technologies, is your country able to just capture that innovation, or because you picked another way, you have basically missed that opportunity? Other uncertainties are linked to socioeconomic development, in like how population will change, what will be the impact of digitalization. In transport, for instance, decarbonization looks a bit different if you assume that you have driverless vehicles on the market in 2030 or 2040. Big uncertainty that you need to take into account when you design your cities. So the answer here is, in terms of the country strategies, we're trying to use those stress tests in a systematic manner to make sure whatever we suggest countries should do is not too dependent on one technology that might never make it. Then there is this question of whether these innovations will be there on time. I think what we need is to have a strategy to achieve our objectives in terms of climate and development, even in some of those technologies never get to market, or like if the size, the potential of those technologies is much smaller than we expect today. And of course, that might require some adjustments, but it doesn't need to break the whole thing. I think that's the short story. And finally, last thing is, every institution has a role, and we are not a technology-focused organization. I mean, we're using a lot of technologies and pushing a lot of technologies, but we're not doing R&D. We're not doing piloting of new-to-the-world technologies. We're doing a lot of new-to-the-country technology. Right? When a technology has worked in Kenya, if we can help the technology to move to Uganda, we will do it, and we do it all the time. But like the first CCS plant and so on, we don't feel it's really our role because we don't have the engineering capacity, and also our procurement is really fighting against us on that. So we have a procurement which is very risk averse, so it's not great to support innovation. So we don't feel like this will be our role, and some other players can be better to put the 10 billions that's needed to do a few big pilots for CCS, for instance. We won't do that because we're not well equipped to do it, and we have other things where we have a better comparative advantage. That's why we have the partners on this screen. It's really important that others are also playing their role.
Fabulous. Thank you for this comprehensive answer. I guess I'll have got one more question. You can just tell us a yes or no, since we are running short on time. It's a question from Matilda, which is that, does the World Bank lobby richer countries into climate financing?
Yes, we do, and we do. So, I mean, let me qualify that. We're not part of the negotiations. So, whatever happened at the COP, I mean, we're at the COP, but we're not a party in the negotiation, and we have no opinion on whatever is decided at the COP. This is countries deciding, and we are in the implementation role. We help country implement whatever they have decided, but we don't participate in that. But of course, we try to make climate finance more efficient. So we're especially trying to blend climate finance with development finance so that we can get climate objectives and development objectives together, but also to leverage. So the idea is really like you use climate finance to leverage development finance, and then you use that package to leverage private capital. And our point is that only by doing this type of leverage, you can get to the scale of investment that we need for this challenge. So on that, we propose solutions all the time, and some of the climate finance is going through the World Bank Group and our partners on that. But again, I think the point to remember is that we're talking about trillions in investments. So the question is not whether climate finance will get to that level, because it won't. The question is how climate finance can help redirect trillions of dollars in the right direction.
Thank you so much. So we're out of time. Stéphane, thank you for this amazing perspective on climate and development that you're kind of uniquely qualified, I think, to give to us. It was absolutely brilliant.